Okay, we're starting. Thank you all for coming to Abolition. They said what they said in the Justice Watch Salon event, where we will be hearing the thoughts of abolitionists in this moment. Um, and we have guests Jason Perez, Monica Cosby, Timmy Chow, Hoda Katebi, Rick Wilson, and Lisa Sango. I'd like for each of the guests to tell us who they are, a little bit about their work in regards to abolition before we begin this conversation. Jason Perez.
Hey, what's up, y'all? Jason Perez, he, him, from Chicago, born and raised, North Side. Yeah, and my work with abolition has been for a while now. My current work is mainly with trying to start up the Defund CPD campaign in Chicago, and working with Black Abolitionist Network to like help set that up, so that we have a campaign where people who feel like they're abolitionists can join the campaign to defund CPD, but also open enough where, you might not feel yourself an abolitionist, but you feel like, hey, defunding CPD is important to like make a better world for us all. So that's the main work I'm doing right now.
Monica Cosby.
Hey, I'm Monica Cosby. I organize for Westside Justice Center, Mount United Against Violence and Incarceration, and some other spaces. Most of my work is directly around the prison, particularly around the criminalization of women and girls that are caught up in the system, right? So we're trying to get people from going, or in some cases to get them out. So we're pushing for clemencies, immediate court support, which is either during the pretrial stage or during like various stages of the appellate courts. And so that's where most of my work lies.
Thank you. Timmy Chow.
What's up, everybody? My name is Timmy, pronouns he, him. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to have this salon-style conversation with a lot of folks that I already know. I do identify as an abolitionist organizer. And what that looks like for me as of late is I'm a co-founder of an organization called Dissenters, and we focus on, we're an anti-war, anti-militarist organization, and also an abolitionist one. And we're really trying to challenge systems of militarism in all its shapes and forms. I also work, I'm a co-director with Prison and Neighborhood Arts Project. We offer arts education and college education programming over at Stateville Prison over in Joliet, Illinois, where we build inside-outside relationships and also try to build movements through arts storytelling, but also through inside-outside movement building and relationship building. Yeah, so that's a bit of how that work is looking like for me.
Thank you. Hoda Katebi.
Hi, thanks for having me. Excited to be on this conversation with all these friends. I am one of the national leads for Believers Bailout, which is a Muslim-led bail organization that bails Muslims using zakat from pretrial and immigration incarceration. And one of the founding members of Blueton Production, which is an all-women immigrant and refugee-run apparel manufacturing workers cooperative, and it's sort of an abolitionist response to the fast fashion industry. So thinking about abolition and capitalism and like the intrinsic links there. And finally, doing a lot of sort of anti-war and anti-sanctions organizing with the No War campaign, which is a little bit more national.
Thank you. Lisa Sango.
Hey everyone, it's really nice to be on the call with y'all. So just a quick introduction. I am with an organization called Movement for Family Power. The work of the organization and much of, I would say, my life's work and activism is to support organizing and movement building around trying to shut down the child welfare and foster system, and looking at how the foster system operates very, very similarly to other extremely sort of criminalizing policing institutions, targets families, targets mamas, takes kids away and destroys families.
Thank you. And last but definitely not least, we have Rick Wilson.
Hey, what's up, everyone? I'm Rick. Yeah, I'm from very, very far south and very, very far suburbs. I identify as abolitionist for a couple of years now. I used to organize, but I do not organize, so I don't go around claiming that I'm an organizer. I'm a official pop-up boy, and I show up and support organizers. I do music full time, and I try to do as much as I can. But I guess my works in abolition is just creating like the world that I want to see around people that I'm around all the time, and I feel like that's a work every day. So I try to just create the world I want to be in everywhere I go, in every city I go to, in every stage I play. So that is my role nowadays.
Solid. Thank you all for joining us for this conversation. We think it's a very timely conversation, and I just want to open up in terms of like defining what abolition is, and how do you define abolition? I really want to point to the calls to defund police. What about that is it abolition? Is it not? Someone can take it away, anyone. We can do it pop-up style but primarily, what is abolition? What does it mean to you? And about the call to like defund CPD or even just police departments nationally. Jason?
Oh, I thought we were gonna do a rock, paper, scissors tournament to see, but okay. Yeah, only speaking for me, I'm not an abolitionist expert. For me, at its most basic level is, having a world without, carceral institutions like prisons and jails and police. So not having that world at all, and so, but then that means a lot of things. So I think, especially in terms of when it comes to solutions around what we call public safety, and in response to the things that we call, violent crime and in crime in general, and crime like put in quotes. And so I look at abolition not just as the elimination of police and prisons, but also the elimination of the conditions that cause what we understand to be violent harm in our society. So when we think of usually most people think of the most extreme examples, so murder, rape, and then usually some forms of like strong arm robbery, things like that. So that's what I think of like at like just like the societal structural level, that we would have to change how our economy is organized, how our political system is organized, and then a lot of like how our even social and cultural industry is organized in order to have an abolitionist world. But then like a first step to that is fighting against police power and prison power. And at least for me, why that is because sometimes we don't think about it, but I feel like so much of our organizing and what we do as organizers is conditioned by how police and carceral systems will respond to us. And that a lot of times it's either an antagonism to that, to kind of highlight how violent those systems are, or we just kind of accept that as is. And we're not realizing how much policing is sucking dry like our working class and organizing lives. And then just with the defund police thing, I don't think defund police in and of itself is abolitionist, right? It can put you on a path to abolition depending on how you organize for it and what you fight for in relation to it. So there's a libertarian and right-wing version of defund, and Koch brothers, Van Jones supported version of defund the police that defunds police and doesn't have anything to do with, public housing for all, decommodification of housing and public goods, still supports things like fast fashion, all these other things. So, I think it's important. And, one of my friends, Ranjit, said, like defunding police is the compromise in many ways. It's abolitionists being like, we're interested in Big Ten abolition and we're going to try to figure things out with y'all. So it's like the soft radical edge of abolition instead of like the outright radical edge of abolition, if you ask me.
I mean, is pretty encompassing for me. I think the only thing I would add is how I understand abolition. I think there's so much conversation about what abolition is and isn't, that sometimes I think folks who are interested in learning more and figuring out what that means, it can be kind of tricky sometimes, at least in my experience having these conversations with folks. But ultimately for me, the basic idea, as Jason mentioned, is trying to move through the world and envision a world without policing and prison and carceral apparatuses. I think within that, for me, it's not just about the institutions of policing and prison, but also the logics and ideological frameworks that kind of justify prisons and policing and what they represent, which is why we get, and what that looks like. So like the impulse to control, dominate, disappear communities, and harm communities. Those are all like also logics that play out not just in in policing and prisons themselves, but also in other institutions. And so I think for me, I also would say that it's always been for me about a world, which means for me, this has always also been connected to an international struggle to be disrupting and challenging these logics. But yeah.
Yeah, I would totally echo all of that. Like, I think that abolition at its core is the understanding that human life has value, like intrinsically, you know, and like human lives aren't disposable and we're like holistic, capable beings. And I think that for me, like, I mean, I was born and raised in this country, but I go back to the Middle East, Iran specifically a lot. And I think something that is such a hallmark of America and a lot of like Western countries is this hyper categorization of identity, hyper categorization of bodies. And all of it is, you know, divide and conquer at the end of the day. And so I think when we think about abolition, like, I think right now it's really amazing and exciting that everyone has sort of turned into some level of an abolitionist overnight, for better or for worse. I think for better. But I think also that it feels like on a grand scheme of things, I think even calls to defund the police are almost reforms, like an easier pill to swallow than like what abolition of violence would look like in our societies. Like, knowing that we can't actually abolish the police without abolishing prisons and the military. And we can't abolish any of those if we're not abolishing capitalism. And I think a lot of us aren't actually ready to have those deeper conversations about what are the police actually protecting. And so how can we actually go down a little bit deeper and like look at the root structures of like why police exist, what happens in prisons, where is labor happening, and what is trying to protect labor. So I think that abolition is definitely abolishing the police and prisons, but also everything that it's connected to. And as both Jason and Timmy mentioned, sort of the world order, and how that is replicated in our own internal relationships. So I think it's the value of human life, but it's also like how we enact with each other, how we hold each other accountable, how the state violence is replicated in our relationships on an intimate level, and dealing with each other, you know, from like children to like parents to even like friends, and how we're holding each other accountable and creating the world that we want to see, both in terms of institutions and in terms of just like our neighborhoods. And something that for me has been particularly like striking these past few weeks, especially, is how we, in order to really be ready for like the systemic abolition, we need to at least know who our neighbors are. You know, if we want to be able to hold each other accountable in a way that's holistic and caring and from love, we need to be able to have that love and have that trust, and view each other as humans. But like, I mean, I'm guilty of not even knowing who lives across from me. I mean, I know Timmy lives under me in the building, but aside from that, there's not many other people who I even know in my own neighborhood. So am I really ready, you know, to like push for a lot of these ways that we need to be holding each other accountable also and building community at the same time, and even before a lot of these we're kind of the vision that we want to see for the world, I think, comes true.
So yeah, I think with abolition, it also involves, and I think you all spoke to this very well. When people first think about it, it involves like tearing down the structures and removing systems and structures. But what does that leave us, right? What is there to build after we abolish? I know that is a fear that people have. Is like, what do we do when the police are gone? What do we do without systems such as jail, or even like Lisa was speaking to, disrupting these services of like family things that also like replicate, I guess, carceral systems. What do we leave people with, or like what can they look forward to and build on?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot. And also when we talk about, like, I think that's another thing that's been happening a lot with when we have talks of abolition. A lot of people are talking about just really dismantling like something to think, especially people who are kind of new to the idea of it. But I think abolition is one understanding and seeing the value in like all human life, and then also like trying to focus on the beauty and the complexities of humans. And I think that, like, I feel like abolition starts like every day, and how you just interacting with the people you see every day, and like, are you trying to turn things that could be like harmful, like little minor things, into something, like transform those into things that can be restorative, and like in the little smallest ways. And like Hoda was saying, like knowing your neighbors and talking to your neighbors, or how are you when you really do get scared, and are you like to the core, are you really trying to practice this like to the core, like when something really happens, like it's your first idea to like call the police, or are you really going to try to, you know what I mean, like create a situation that can be transformative without really involving them? And I think that's when it really starts, because if folks were are thinking of only dismantling and demolishing and destroying, and not trying to practice that or create that world every day, now I feel like that can I don't know, then what would we create? We would create like something that is like a replica of the society we have now and the way we do things now. And I mean, and that means to the core though. It's like, how do you react when people that you don't know, strangers you don't know, approach you a certain way? You know what I mean? Like, how do you do that? Is your first thought to call the police? I think that's like real hardcore, like, you know what I mean? Like trying to practice it and like trying to create it now, and not wait until something is destroyed to try to create it. That's my piece.
I guess abolition for me, I think, is freedom from violence, right? And so obviously the violence of the state, right, of policing and prisons. I make the comparison a lot that it's a domestic violence relationship, right? It's interpersonal violence. But so when I say freedom from violence, I mean obviously the violence of the state, but also interpersonal violence, domestic violence, right? So one of the things that I think about is, you know, when we call for defunding the police, like I'm also on some defund the prison shit, right? A concern that I have is, I don't even know how to say this nice, so I'm just not. I'm just gonna say it. When the police get defunded, because they're gonna, and then they will be disbanded and disarmed, but while we're in the defunding part, there's gonna be, I don't know what people call it, the nonprofit industrial complex or whatever. And so one of the things I worry about is there's going to be all kinds of like diversion programs to not, but they're still going to be part of these institutions that funnel people to the prisons, like DCFS and domestic violence shelters and that kind of stuff. So when we're like defund the police, we have to get that and determine where it goes. Like housing for real, that's not coercive. You know, new models of mental health care, mental wellness. I think about this a lot because that word that everybody talks about for people that keeps going back to prison, that recidivism rate that's always so high that criminal justice reformers and everybody keeps talking about, we tend to, I think society overall tends to blame the individuals that keep going back. So the people that go back to prison are most oftentimes not those people that we call violent offenders. It's the non-violent offenders that return to prison repeatedly. They're struggling with substance abuse or addiction issues and mental wellness issues, right? And and we always say about folks that they're just not ready to stop getting high. And I'm always like, well, what if the different models and treatment programs and whatever the fuck we're using aren't working? The system has been doing the same stuff and approaching things the same way forever. So it's time to just take that for us and decide what it is we need and how. And if it really is a thing like people just got to be ready, then how do we make that happen? Right? But that's for us to determine. It can't be these smaller, larger institutions that are part of the state or adjacent to it that keep funneling. And that's something that I think about all the time. Like when I think of defunding the police as like liberating resources that were stolen from our communities and give it the fuck back. That's what I got.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, I was just gonna add, I think part of, this moment of abolition is defined or is connected to, what Du Bois called abolition democracy, in Black Reconstruction, and abolition democracy was supposed to be, if Reconstruction actually was completed to like what it was supposed to be, which was, actual public education controlled, democratically controlled by Black people. All these public services and certain amounts of reparations that would have happened in response to what happened with slavery. So, at least for me, I think, so abolition, the people who have like pushed like the scholarship of it, and the thinking around it, did have a theory, did have like a perspective on government and what it should look like and not look like, and also had a perspective on what the economy should look like and not look like, right? It's not just the state that enforces carceral carceral logics, right? It's also the economy, right? Like whenever you're a worker who's getting not paid a living wage, whenever you're in the informal sector of the economy, and that work isn't recognized, right? When we're talking about criminalization of sex work, right? These are all things that deal with the economy, that also produce and put in, for me at least, carceral forms of violence. I think the other piece too is that, just remembering the history of abolition in relation to Black feminism, Black radical feminism, and in response to the carceral ways which other feminists, not Black radical feminists, were responding to issues around domestic violence, and in terms of like the non-profitization of spaces where survivors could go to, and then also like the carceral responses, thinking that will actually change behaviors in terms of interpersonal violence. So I think that's just always just a good like place to like ground where we're thinking of and how we're pushing, our ideas of where to go. Because, it's important to take on like what we are in terms of as individuals, what we do, but we also have to build like larger communal systems, and figure out how we want those to be, actually, some of them actually be a part of government, but not part of the state. And for me, the line between government and state is, government is this thing that we democratically elect and control. The state is the thing that has the legitimate monopoly of force and violence, right? That's why getting rid of police and prisons is so important to me, because I don't think you can ever have a democratic government as long as you have a police and prison force. And same with the military also. So I just to like build within those like historical traditions of just like having a long view of abolition, and not just that like it's right here in this moment and just about defund in this narrow way.
I just want to add and thank everybody so much for the wisdom that's being shared here. Also want to add that we, especially because we are pushing for contraction and eventual abolition of the child welfare system, we get asked all the time. And I think in part because we have a lot of work ahead of us in terms of reclaiming the narrative, whereas folks in the criminal legal system reform and abolition space and immigration space and other spaces have a little bit further along in terms of reclaiming the narrative, but we have a lot of work ahead of us in terms of reclaiming the narrative of child and family safety. And so the child welfare system really still has a very dominant and tight hold on it. So we get asked all the time, well, if not this system, then what? And we have many responses that, sort of many of which reflect a lot of the shared wisdom and knowledge and work of so many folks before us. And, another thing that we always add is that these systems have had very, 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 very long times and a lot of resources and just commitment, social commitment and political commitment to build themselves. And we sort of need that same, as we're reimagining the world, we need also space, and we need to give space to healers and birth workers and visionaries and artists and all these people who perhaps have a skill set that is different than the dismantling skill set. We need to give space for that, to give time, to give resources, and to have like a real social, political commitment to that. And I think this, and this, I'm sort of just saying things that are reflective of the things that we've learned. I think one thing that is important is that no one person or movement can sort of do it all, and I think these are very, very, very different skill sets, I think, and sort of knowing where one skill set lies. Does it lie in sort of figuring out what the problem is, identifying the injustice, does it lie in reclaiming the narrative? Does it lie in sort of imagining what's next? And all of us working in that ecosystem sort of as we build together. And jointly sort of demanding that space to do that work, I think, is really important. So that's all I'll add.
So I want to go back, and I think Lisa did touch on this, and I think we're transitioning into a conversation about imagining abolition. But before we do, I really want to go back and talk about how do people come into this framework? What is this modern abolitionist movement? I think a lot of folks reading about this just woke up, saw riots take place, and then people saying defund the police and think like that is the go-to. And now you have politicians saying, this isn't possible. Some saying it is. But what is this history of, or how did we get to this moment? What is this history? Who are these thinkers who have been thinking about modern abolition? Kind of like set the historical tone for this, and even in your personal lives, like I think it will be good for us to know, like how did you come into this theoretical framework?
Okay, I guess I'll go first real quick. How I got into the framework was I don't know. It was I was 16, and I became a Chicago Freedom Fellow. And then I have a big, huge love for history. So me and Henry and Miriam Kaba gave me a bunch of books to read, and it didn't really hit until like I was like stuck up and robbed by like somebody that's like they live around where my cousin lived. And I went through a whole like system of like identifying them, and it was like this cousin, these two cousins, they were 14 and 15, and I went through the whole court thinking that I get my stuff back that I got like stolen from me. And after I pointed them out, they went into like juvie, and I didn't get anything back, and I didn't feel good after that. And from there, I just kind of like was like, there's got to be like some different ass way to deal with like the shit that happens to me. And I didn't really. Then I also realized that like the police is not fucking for us. And then from there were like other things that happened. But I remember that initial thing that happened when I was 16 is what kind of like got me into like just thinking like this shit is fucked up. And this shit not for us. So that's my little story.
some of it is from me being in prison for 20 years, but even before then, I'm born and raised in Chicago, right? And I've always been on the north side or the south side. If I wasn't in Uptown, I was in Englewood. I just have always been in Chicago, and I have seen since I was a kid what the police do. I like the same thing. I know that they're not for us. Like I can remember the police coming and dragging my dad to jail. Like that kind of runs in the family, you know, and it's not supposed to, you know, and but it was always knowing that they weren't they weren't right. And I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, and growing up and being in Uptown in particular, like all the organizing that happened then when we were like fighting to get our kids lead tested right throughout the city, and you know, in the 80s, and all this other kind of work. We used to sit around and talk about the establishment and creating and building something called the Free People's University, right? To just those people, you know, those of us who wanted to learn whatever it was we wanted to learn could work with people that were doing that and learn that way, and just not have to go through the big gigantic educational institutions, right? Just create our own create and live in our own world. And so I actually started working with the Chicago Area Black Lung Association, Uptown People's Law Center, when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, right? And it was just, so a part of it was like, for me, it was the people that I worked with every day, you know, Tink, who lived right across the hall from me, right? Her name was Kenzella Hadley. I'm just kind of always, when working in prison, it was, I didn't use the same language of abolition that I use now, right? It was a little bit different language that I was using back then, but it was the same kind of thing of creating our own stuff with our own folks and doing what we needed to do, not to just to survive a system, certainly, but to be able to sustain ourselves while we're doing the work. And that was like early teachers. And then a lot of it was like poetry for me while I was in prison. And certainly since I've been out, it's people that I follow on Facebook or Twitter. And if Charles, I follow you, Timmy, I talk to you, right? And so it's people that I follow on Twitter that I learn from. So there's folks that, like, if they put something up, y'all should check out this article, listen to this podcast. Like, that's what I do. So there's like Kelly Hayes, Miriam, of course, Ruthie Wilson-Gilmore. So I'm learning a different language for a lot of stuff that I already felt, in addition to, so there's some things like I'm learning language that goes with what I've already been believing and feeling and work that I've been doing. And there are new things that I'm learning and new approaches, right? I think that, Hoda, is this you? I've heard one of us were saying that we have to leave room for people to learn, right? And I think that's really, really important. I think a lot of times that, like, depending on the space I'm in, I'll talk about abolition without actually saying the word, right? And so when you tell people, like, everybody deserves housing, right? And it's not even a matter of deserving, like, that's a right of the people. We tell people, you believe everyone should have housing, you believe healthcare should be for all people, like, all of these things, people are always like, yeah. And then when you say abolition, they're like, oh no, but what do we do about the bad people, you know, or whatever it is. But I think when you present it to folks in just this realistic way, there's always been, like when I was growing up, if I did something, if I even looked like I was gonna do something, there was some grown person somewhere that was gonna go tell my mom or my dad, you know what I'm saying? And it was that way of taking care of each other in community, you know, and dealing with harm when it happens in the ways that we need to, that are not dependent on the state. Like we've always, it's happening now in all kinds of places, and it always has. So it's just building on that, and it's also teaching out violence, right? It's getting rid of the violence of the state, but it's also not codifying or coddling violence, especially interpersonal violence and domestic violence, right? It's teaching that out, teaching out the okayness of committing doing interpersonal harm. And so it's all of those things. I feel like I'm rambling, so I'm shutting up.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, for myself, you know, my personal journey to abolition was was more so just through seeing what worked in my own life. Like, I had to be part of DCFS, and it was as simple as, I was locked up. Luckily, I came from a middle class family, so my mom could like be at the court, and it was literally like I would have had to do like a bunch of time in like Little Joliet, or I would have gone to a group home. And so my mom was like just trying to figure out what would be the best thing. And so she chose like group home. And that's only because like my mom was there to advocate for that. That was like, thought of as the lesser evil. But then, so then I had to live at a group home. And then after that, it was, I got back out of the group home and still like was doing dumb shit. And I'm never not one to say like, the things I did was harmful. Like, I did rob people, I did sell drugs to people, things like that. But, a lot of it was just that it was the piece about recidivism. It was just like, my behavior wasn't actually changing anytime like I got punished for stuff. And when I was locked up, it was the same thing. But once I got out the last time, it was like, I joined a 12-step program, and a 12-step program has like a very different terms around what accountability looks like, how to take ownership for accountability, and then like how to make things right to people, and like it's like a very solid system of like how you actually make things right. And it has nothing to do with being punitive or punishment focused at all. So I think it was that part, like that's then what actually helped me recover, right? It wasn't like any threat of going back to the state. Like I had times when I would drop dirty. It just didn't matter. Like it just like, the threat of incarceration wasn't actually changing my behavior. So it was that piece. And then also the piece of just like, I got blessed that like I got hired by ACLU, and like they told me what felony discrimination was, because I was being discriminated before and I didn't realize it. But so I mean, it was one part just having that knowledge, but the other part of just like having a job. And I feel like if I hadn't gotten a job within like the first 2 or 3 months, I remember that interview, because I was like literally handing out flyers like over by UFC from like a day labor thing. And I was thinking like, I'm not going to keep on getting up for day labor and doing this if one more person says no to me, And luckily they said yes to me, because I was just like, I'm going to go back to drug dealing. And most of the time why I did drug dealing wasn't, I mean, my parents were broke, but like they didn't have money just to give me money, So it was like, and I didn't like to do just like the minimum wage job that was available to a teenager, like ASM dollars, right? So then I would sell drugs in order to have money, which to me, it was just like a very simple way to make sure young people don't do that, is to pay them like, ASM like pays basically poverty wages, right? It's just paying kids like what they actually deserve in terms of for their labor and work, And so I think all those kind of things was just like all the things that were positive that caused me to change my behavior in my life, and make me a better person, had nothing to do with me being incarcerated, me going through the system, anything like that. Even when I was a kid and like my parents were just like, they were just basic kind of old school parents, which was just like, you do something, like you get your ass beat, you know what I'm saying? Like, that's just like how it was. And so many times, like, that didn't necessarily change my behavior, getting grounded didn't change my behavior. It was like the moment I had a chance to like really be in a process where I could reflect on my behavior, be given tools so that I could intervene on my behavior in meaningful ways. That's how I became a better person. And so I think that's what, brought me to abolition, in terms of like what was said before of like, I knew that's what I wanted. And then like when I actually heard the language of abolition, through Angela Davis, through like Ruth Gilmore, and then eventually through Miriam Kaba, and a lot of like the school to prison pipeline organizing that I would do with like Southwest Youth Collaborative, and Center for Third World Organizing. That's when I was just like, oh, this is where I'm actually at. And as someone, for me, like who's like an anti-capitalist and as a Puerto Rican who believes in decolonization, I just felt like we can't get to like anti-capitalism, socialism. We can't get to decolonization as long as we have like a military and a police force and prisons breathing down our neck. Like, I just don't see the way you get there, And so that's like what connected all the dots for me.
Yeah, my own, I guess, like understanding of at least the language around abolition came 100% from like Black organizers in Chicago. Before that, I was a student and I was doing a lot of like Palestinian solidarity work. And that for me like made a lot of sense. And like I got it, and it was just something that like I think I grew up a lot learning a lot about. And And then I randomly, you know, was invited to like come to this like secret meeting in a warehouse, and I was like, okay. And I go, and it was actually, you know, the planning for the shutting down of all of the International Chief of Police Conference back in October. And I was like, wow, what's happening? And I mean, just on that first day, the amount of just like love and trust in that space was so overwhelming for me and so powerful. And literally I remember Paige May being like, yeah, so we don't really believe in police. And I was like, okay. And I didn't really like have the language for like why that was, but like I trusted her and I trusted everybody in that space. And I'm just like, everyone seems cool if they're saying like, fuck the police, then like I'm cool with it. And I think eventually like I was able to like learn the language through the work of like Angela Davis, you know, who calls Palestine one of the biggest or the biggest open air prison, and is able to really draw those connections internationally. For me were really powerful to be able to connect. What I saw was just like continuous violence in the lives of people you know, who are Muslim and in the Middle East and across Africa was the military. And that for me was like a very clear, like, you know, I didn't believe in the military. And so being able to connect that and be like, wow, actually, you know, the military, the local police force was trained by the military, like all of these are actually really connected. For me made it make sense that like, obviously the police force needs to be abolished along with the military. So I think a lot of also kind of what Jason and Monica was saying about the sort of understanding of like what the world was that I wanted, and then being able to like develop that language and frame it as abolition. I mean, also as like someone who's Muslim, like I think for me, a lot of my organizing work is really deeply rooted within the values of Islam, which again centers humanity. And I think that's something that's like really powerful for me is that like, you know, to kill one innocent life is to kill all of mankind. And so the police have killed all of mankind again and again and again. So as a Muslim, you know, what does that mean for me as my obligation to be able to also see sort of the systems of injustice and like what my role is in that, but also like what I guess religiously or spiritually is sort of what the value of human life looks like. And it's a, you know, for me, like I understand Islam to be very anti-punitive justice, you know, like justice looks like a transformation of society. Justice looks like this, justice looks like all of these life-giving institutions. And so I think now I'm able to also develop a lot of language just through something that is like the core of my belief system, and being able to articulate that within what that means today in the United States on stolen land, you know, as an active military empire. And I think all of these come together really well, and seeing how deeply connected these systems are. So, I mean, of course, you know, the work of Angela Davis, also Mariam Kaba, also Benji Hart. I learn a lot from Benji, and I love their work so much, and others like them. So I think for me, it's a lot of like, I agree, just seeing like what makes sense and what feels right. And then being able to later develop the language and words around that based on what we're seeing and how we can understand, like we see that the city has millions and millions of dollars because they want to build a police academy with that. And so it just feels so logical, you know, that like schools are closing, so that money should go towards schools, you know. And I think the more I feel like that I'm also immersed in different community spaces and like building with people on the ground, like it is like obvious, you know. It's like it's so like you have to have like play mental gymnastics to make anything else make sense. And so I think I'm very grateful for just being able to like be in a lot of these spaces to learn from Black organizers on the ground who have really like allowed all of that learning for me, at least.
So one question I would like to put out. So as we see there's this viral moment of police killings and police shootings, people being hashtagged, been the thing for years now. And oftentimes families call for justice. They call for probably like what justice means to them is the jailing of said police officer. Is that abolitionist, and can it be abolitionist? How do you work through this idea that families have this idea of justice and believe that the person who harmed their own should be locked up, and that person being of the state as well, yeah. Can you work through that thinking? Is that abolitionist? Is it an abolitionist call or not?
I'll just say a couple things. I'll try to be quick because I'm also curious to hear what my co-panelists think about this. But I think for me, in having this, like, what does justice look like? I think what abolition and you know, along with abolition, a theory of transformative justice forces us to reckon with when we think about what justice even means or what safety means is it kind of it forces us to look at problems, the root causes of problems, and it also forces us to rethink or redefine who is harmed during an individual act of violence or when violence occurs, right? Because it forces, I think, kind of a collective like perspective on understanding how we who is harmed and how we respond to harm. So when we're talking about police violence, abolition, I think, forces us to consider how we as a community failed, right? And so I think related to some of the points that have been made, like justice is necessarily also a conversation about all the steps that led up to that instance, and all the lack of resources, opportunities, and funding that we as a community allowed to take place that informed that situation. So I think and if we accept that, the ways in which the community is in part responsible for instances of in particularized or individual instances of violence at a collective level, that also means it changes how we have to understand justice also at a collective level, right? So I think then, so what that means is, like, does jailing an officer get at the root cause of policing as a system, or the violence of policing in prison as a system? Abolition, I don't think so. And I think it forces us to really look at the systemic nature of violence and how we as a collective are also a part of creating what justice looks like moving forward.
Yeah, I always think that there's a difference between a commitment to abolition as ideology, and then a commitment to abolition as an organizer, moving with people and having. And I mean, I think it's first just to say that there is a tension in all of our work around TJ work, RJ work, abolition, especially when we talk about survivor-led responses. And usually what we mean is not survivor in the big sense, because abolition has this idea that, we're all survivors at some level when there's harm, and we shouldn't individualize harm. But usually we mean it in the people who are more directly impacted by it. So families of police officers. So, Ahmaud Arbery's family said they want the death penalty, right? Breonna Taylor's family wants those officers charged, and so on and so forth. So what do we do as abolitionists around that? And I think it's just it's being honest about our politics, right? It's saying that so I mean, on the ideological end, we can say, hey, that's not our politics, that's not what we're down for, right? But then I think as organizers, we have some level of commitment to work with those communities in the place where they are, right? But then also still in a way that points to the larger vision of hey, this is actually what will get to the root cause of A, B, and C, right? So and I think I think a lot of organizers do that, and there's a skillful way to do it, so that we're not just this fundamentalist ideologue saying this other thing, while also just being honest about maybe that's more in the incarceration bucket or the reform bucket, or how they do it. But I do feel that most of abolition gets learned as the action that Hoda did, and Charles was a part of it too. We were part of organizing that action when it first happened, and just to hear your story that, oh, that's what brought you to it. So I honestly do believe, and it's my own organizer confirmation bias, of that the action of the work will actually bring you to that. And so I think it's far better to support those families, but to limits, right? I don't, I myself don't know. So, Miriam just had a post about this today in terms of how people are viewing accountability and transformative justice. Transformative justice doesn't promise hey, survivor, we will do all these things, right? We you know, it's within a framework in terms of how we see and understand survivor support and following through on that. So I think it's just those distinctions are important while still trying to connect to the meaningful work of what people want for accountability, even if it goes against some of our ideological dispositions and beliefs.
If I could just say one thing real quick, and I would be remiss if I didn't, but I was having this conversation with one of my dear friends who is incarcerated at Stateville. He's incarcerated for a long-term to life sentence. And we were talking about the uprisings in response to George Floyd and the calls for justice and calls to jail these killer cops. And I think it's about survivor-led healing, but also a fundamental clear understanding of what we're calling for, and also understanding that a lot of these calls for justice history shows us especially ones that require the state to enact, whether it's sentencing or jailing, we know that they will always disproportionately be leveraged against poor Black and brown people. So in my conversation with my friend, we're talking about, like, you know, how can we just make calls to justify these sentences that are gonna justify why hundreds of us are locked in behind bars right now, right? And where does that leave us in terms of violence and the violence of incarceration that we are experiencing every day on 24/7 lockdown? And what do we stand to lose when that is our so-called justice?
So shifting, but I've heard a lot of words, RJ, TJ. What do these things mean? I think RJ means restorative justice. But what does that look like, I guess, in a world without these carceral systems? What is there, like, large scale restorative justice, and how do you imagine that or implement that? I'm curious, how is it practiced, and why is this, I guess, an answer in regards to the abolishing these carceral systems in logic? Just curious.
I guess technically I lost. Well, I think that I think, and it's something that I think some of us also mentioned in the first question. For me, I think what restorative justice or even transformation justice requires, before Jason goes to describe what those processes mean, I think at the very core require strong relationships, requires a sort of detachment from, like, a hyper individualistic society, hyper capitalistic society, and that's really, really challenging. And I think that I think that there's so much work that needs to be done in terms of really, like, delving deep into where we need to be on the non-sexy work of doing, you know, sexy protests and things like that. And these demands are really powerful, but, like, the work that doesn't warrant an Instagram post, you know, you can't post about, like, oh, I just met with my neighbor today, you know? So I think, like, this is the work that is, like, deeply, deeply critical, and I think sort of precedes even being able to have a conversation about restorative justice if those relationships aren't there, because that all requires like, literally loving the people who are around you and viewing them like family. Like, I think for me, like, a very easy example is, like, if my younger brother, like, fucks up, like, I'm not gonna, like, go, like, put him in his room and lock the door for, like, 5 hours. I'm gonna be like, why did you do this? You know, and I think the love and, like, compassion that we show our family members or people that we love and care about, we just need to be able to replicate that on a, like, larger community scale, and viewing everybody in our neighborhood sort of on that level and giving them that respect of, like, basic humanity. And so I think that's, like, a lot of work that's really, really challenging. And I think that there's so much that we have to do to get to that point. And I think obviously the state knows that. And I think the state is very highly invested in sort of continuing a dividing and conquer strategy, whether it's through class, whether it's through sort of, like, having this idea that, like, even like in Chicago, like the hyper segregation of neighborhoods, you know, and I think the sort of emphasis of those, and the way that we even saw that played out when a lot of the uprisings first happened, and how violent those tensions really like manifested. So I think that there's so much work that's happening on the ground that I think that I think people, maybe for like people who are watching this who maybe are not even ready with the conversation of abolition, they can start by just building relationships. And I think that's a really powerful road that people who are sort of new to this conversation can start doing, that's like a road toward abolition. And I think that it's challenging and complicated, but I feel like, so I mean, I get a lot of death threats all the time, and so I wouldn't feel safe if I didn't have actual relationships with people like in my building, people who I knew I could trust and be like, okay, if this person who just sent me a death threat online literally yesterday, can you just look out, you know, if like you see this person around, like let me know. But I couldn't be able to do that if like I didn't know anybody, I didn't trust anybody. So like my ability to not call the police whenever I feel like actual physical threats of violence, not unconstantly, I think is only because I've built those relationships with people who I trust and love. So I think that's one of the most important first steps.
For me, restorative justice also is a new phrase for me that I learned when I got out. So I've always been familiar with the concept of circle, right? And I've always kept circle and stuff like this. While I was locked up, we had talking circle training, and before we even did that, we had this class for nonviolent communications. Right? So I did the nonviolent communications class, you know, for the week, and then we spent like a whole week, 5 hours a day in circle with like little small breaks, you know, to do talking circles and stuff. I got out, and well, actually, this thing happened while I was in prison. So I was asked to keep a circle, right? And in the nonviolent communication class, they were like, you have to talk like this and use this I language and this, all this stuff. And it also was in a space where like we were encouraged to ask questions, right? So I'm like, whatever, because I'm going to do whatever I'm going to do. And so we get in a circle, and I'm trying to use the right language. And one of the women that was in a circle with us was visibly agitated, right? But she was just waiting and just holding on to what she had until she got the talking piece. She gets the talking piece and she snaps out. She was like, why is everything about you? You keep saying I, like she snapped out. She was like, we don't even talk like this for real, right? And I was like, okay, so we're just going to be us in here. And all we agreed to was we were going to use the talking piece and shut up when whoever had it, everybody else is going to shut the fuck up, right? And that's how we did our circle. I think that in terms of restorative justice, it cannot be considered like this elite thing, and it certainly can't be coerced out of somebody. Like you can't have police in a restorative justice circle. There's no legal or constitutional protections for fucking one, you know what I'm saying? And I'm of the thought that like a cop is a cop all day long, right? And it's also coercive because if you're pulling somebody in a circle on pain of going to jail or some other kind of thing, like that's not even restorative at all. How is that restorative, right? So I think restorative justice for me is being in right relationship. It's understanding everyone in that circle understands their place in this ecosystem that we're living in, right? It's being in right relationship with everyone, with everything, with all life. So to me, that's what restorative justice is. And I think if we looked at it that way, that leads to transformation of certainly the person who has harmed people. I just got to say this thing in terms of restorative justice, or just period. There's always that fool that will ask the question, well, what if you get raped or some crap, right? And I have been. What do you think happens in prison? And most women I know in prison, out of prison, that have ever been to prison have been raped. Most of the women I know just have experienced all kind of harm, right? And so if you say to me like, well, what are you going to do if that happens to you? It's certainly not call the police so they can ask me, well, why? You know, and blame it on me. They certainly can't unrape me. So it's already happened to me. What I would prefer is to live in a world where this doesn't happen to me, but because it already has, I want to help build a world where it doesn't happen again. I got daughters, I got grandkids, You know, I got nieces, I got nephews, my friends have children. You know, this is what restorative justice should be. Restorative justice should be abolition, right? Because if it's not, I hate when people say restore humanity because like we already have it, you know. I think it's to respect humanity. I think that's what, you know, folks could be saying, but it's not about a restoration of humanity that didn't go anywhere, right? It's understanding and being really and truly in right relationship in this world. And I think that's what abolition is. I don't think that they should be separate. I think restorative justice should be abolition.
You played rock, paper, scissors and you're not gonna go?
Oh, you're talking about me. I thought Charles was saying something. No? Okay. Sorry. Oh, my bad.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Oh, no, I mean, restorative justice. Yeah, I think, I think this is another tension within abolition work, right? And decarceration work overall. I think there's, very valid reasons why people say, the basics of how I understand restorative justice versus transformative justice. Restorative justice is, let's say I rob a house and I break a window, right? And instead of that person, calling the police, they meet with me. I'm assuming a child did this, so they meet with the parents or like the extended family. They have a thing, the person who did the harm, their job is to maybe fix the window and then also, maybe do some chores or things like that. And then that's restorative, right? And then transformative justice is, we want to change the conditions of why that person robbed the house in the first place, right? We want a world with less robberies, and then, and you can just take that and go on, like less of these types of harms. And so that would usually mean maybe that person needs to get paid more. Maybe they need a basic income. Maybe they need other types of material or economic supports or political supports or social supports, and the list can go on, but then we want to change the world so that that happens. Also too, like when it comes to like organizational culture, then let's say if it happens within an incident happens within an organization or specific community, transformative justice also says, hey, there's something about how our organization is built up right now that we need to change and reevaluate so that maybe these types of harms don't happen again. So that's how I understand it. In terms of like, what does that look like for the day-to-day? I mean, I think in some abolition circles, there's people who are like, it's great that CPS is doing restorative justice, right? And it's less than suspensions and it's less than school to prison pipeline stuff and this thing, the other thing. And then there's other folks who are just like, CPS is still carceral. Oh, Chicago Public Schools, sorry, I'm using jargon again. Chicago Public Schools, it's still carceral. It's not good, and so we should be concerned about if any government entity ever takes on like transformative justice, restorative justice. So I think that caution is valid. But I also think that part of what the power for defund the police is that it's something like someone like my mom who's not an abolitionist, someone like my aunt who's not an abolitionist, or they can understand that, right? And because it's attached to this thing that they know that's in their lives, which is government. My mom, she might not ever really know everybody as a neighbor, right? My mom doesn't really like knowing her neighbors, right? There's a whole group of people who don't like doing that. That's just who they are to the core, right? They have their family and that's it, right? But, I think my mom would reasonably like to call 311 instead of 911 if there's even a thing like a robbery, because why do you need a cop there? They're just writing down what got stolen, what got taken, and then maybe there'll be a follow-up process. Or if something else happens, she would like to call a number, but also know that because in her mind, right, she thinks about her son or her granddaughter being like, anytime I call the police. So she's at that point where anytime I call the police, I could be putting someone's life in danger. Like that problem is not going to actually be taken care of. But what we don't have is solutions that are just outside of, know everyone in your community and do all this stuff. I'm assisting with the TJ process right now. It is a labor intensive process. It is a lot of work. It's hours upon hours of work. And that's not for everybody. And I think there's a way that we can be okay with it. There's a way that we can have someone where you pick up the phone and you do it and they're in relation to it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. And then it's a way that we can scale up to it, but also make a guarantee that this can never lead to prisons, jails, or any sort of form of system of coercion. And I think, at least to me, that would be, some sort of ideal solution.
So, yeah, I want to combine a few questions because, 7 o'clock is our conclusion time. So, what's happening now? And I really want to tap into Lisa and Rick on this, especially with how media views abolition. What has the media gotten wrong about it? How is it viewing now? And really talking about, this moment. I know Rick is very vocal on social media and is like one of the only, I guess, music artists who are like vocal about abolition. I would like to see or hear about how those conversations play in his respective circles. And with Lisa, I don't think the media has done a good job in tying the child welfare system to something like abolition. And if you can you expound on that? And then everyone in general, just talk about what's being talked about in this moment and what's not being talked about in this moment by media.
Yeah. Well, shit. For me, I haven't even heard the word abolition on TV ever. I hear defund. I hear defund, like defund, disband is why I hear that sometimes too. So I mean, I just use that because a lot of people I talk to are people that are not, in circles where this is ever even mentioned about. Like when people hear words like that, the first person they call up is me. I have so many friends and people around me are calling me up, asking me questions about defunding. And I just think when I see it in the media, I just see it as like, okay, well, I'm gonna use this as a step to the end goal, to getting to a point where there is I'm dismantling the PIC. But I'm using everything as like steps, baby steps every day. So I mean, that's why when I see defund and then I saw something about Fox posting BLM demands, I just use all that shit as steps to talking points when I'm talking to folks every day in my life, because I see a whole bunch of different types of folks in my life. So that's what I use it as. I use it to my advantage. I think it's gonna be a long time before we hear people talking about RJ, TJ, or abolition on TV. But until then, I'm going to be using everything to the advantage for the side that I want to see come out with W. So I don't know about you guys.
So I would agree that I don't hear a lot of talk about defund, not as much about abolition, but just in discourse when I am learning about abolition and conversation with abolition, which I do 100% consider an incredible sort of privilege. To have these frameworks sort of available to us and to sort of live and share a world with folks who are doing this work. I would say I think conversation can only hold so much at one time, and so I don't sort of want to make it sound like there's something being left out and it is something that we're bringing to the conversation. I just think conversation is inherently limited. But absolutely, we definitely hear about abolition or even defunding in terms of prisons. Well, now these days, police, also prisons, and the carceral really sort of deeply, deeply racist and fucked up nature of our society runs deep, way, 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 way beyond prisons and police. I would say the foster system, child welfare agents, this is just one small example of many, many, many carceral institutions. And I appreciate someone else's contribution around how fast fashion, it needs to be abolished and is part of this carceral system. And 1,000,000%. I'm really learning from that comment. I would also say that I hear, we two of the things that I feel like it's just things that I've been thinking about a lot in the conversation is that I think a big part of abolition is our very conception. It's transforming our very conception of violence and harm, and that, like, you know, in the defund police conversations, I feel like we don't hear. We are starting to see bubblings of it, but I don't think we hear enough of it to. Well, I hope to hear more of it to sort of move us more so in the direction that I think we all want to be going, which is really interrogating structural harms while building space for addressing transformative space for addressing interpersonal harms. Lastly, I would say, and this is something I've been having a deep craving to do more reading about, is, you know, it seems to me that abolition is not a destination, but just a constant sort of work in progress. I don't imagine there's any perfect future that we or future generations will occupy, and maybe that's just pessimistic of me, but I think of it less as a destination and more as a calling in terms of how we do the work and how we are in relation with each other, and how we build.
So yeah, again, curious to know what folks see in this moment, especially like from media. What are they not seeing? Also, you know, there was a criticism against abolition levied by Mayor Lightfoot, and that the movement is undemocratic, and that it's asking for something that isn't supported by most people. Will people support abolition? So, like, what do we think about, I guess, abolition's like placement in the media, and what's not being talked about? What's not being talked about? Is it undemocratic?
Well, one, I think it's just ironic that the mayor who just pushed through an executive a legislation for more executive authority and taking away more power from our city alderman people is talking about undemocratic. So that's just funny to me. I'm not surprised, but I do think that, you know, going back to something well, I'm not surprised that, you know, the conversation about abolition is, you know, political elites, and you know, a lot of folks are scared about it because of what I think the word abolition, a lot of folks kind of frame the ideas. But I think going back to what Monica says, you know, what abolition is about is freedom from violence. And if you're trying to tell me that everybody I know is trying to, you know, is trying to free ourselves from violence, and ultimately it's about building up, supporting life. It's a politics of supporting life, and reducing suffering. It's, for me, it's as simple as that sometimes. And so when we're talking about, like, do people support it? You know, theoretically that's our job as organizers, to build with our folks and try to work through the understandings and the education and how we're relating to these concepts. But ultimately, abolition is a politics that supports life, and is trying to reduce harm and violence. And I know most of the people that I'm in community with, that I talk to and connect with, can 9 times out of 10 can agree with that kind of fundamental commitment.
Yeah, maybe this is an unpopular opinion. I'll get shit for this online later, but honestly, I don't give a damn. I don't care if people support it or not. Like, if it's the right thing to do, it's the right thing to do. You know, if it's, I mean, obviously everything that is like, I mean, these systems that we live in are not made to care for us. That's also why America is has continued the highest number of COVID cases globally, despite being a first world country, it's because this country is set up to completely warp people's reality. And that's something that we also talked about at the beginning. It's this normalization of what violence is and what violence isn't. You know, we see people destroying a Starbucks or like a bank, and people calling that violent, and not the Starbucks or the bank that's looting their wages for decades and centuries, you know, not violent. So it's just a language game, and they're playing that language game. At the core, like, I agree with Timmy, everyone who I know supports the, you know, the sanctity of life. But on top of that, I honestly don't give two shits if it's not majority supported by the people, because it's what is needed and it's what is right. So yeah, too bad, so sad.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's funny that Lightfoot would care about democracy. I'm glad Lori Lightfoot has joined the side of democracy in its broadest sense. So that's good. You know, I think it's always important to remember, right, that majority of Americans, especially white Americans, didn't support integration. There was a while when a majority of Black Americans didn't support doing civil disobedience in order to desegregate the South and to desegregate other areas. So they were like, yes, desegregation, but no to mass civil unrest in order to get there. So, you know, I think, you know, that's always going to be a dynamic. I think the job of an organizer is to figure out, how do you get to majorities, right? Or how do you get to a place where things are so ungovernable that, you know, someone like Lori Lightfoot and those other aldermen, especially the Black and Latinx aldermen that we're going to have to move, get to that point. And, you know, how we do that is by mass civil disobedience or mass direct action. And that, to me, is a part of democracy. Democracy, if you're looking at democracy at just one person, one vote, and first of all, we don't have that. But even in theory, if we did have that, that's, like, to me, one of the lowest forms of political engagement and what makes us political beings. You know, I'm a big part of it, and all the things that we celebrate, even white people celebrate, like the Boston Tea Party, things like that, is in fact robust protests, uprisings, riots, things like that. So, you know, I mean, in many ways, Lori Lightfoot is using fascist type language, which is, she doesn't believe that uprisings, rebellions, and riots are part of the democratic process. I believe that they are, right? I believe that listening to billionaires, having them control the city's politics, having them control the city's public finances, is undemocratic. These are all things that Lori Lightfoot does. In terms of just like how it's looked, like how abolition is looked at in the media, you know, I kind of look at, like, defund police is doing for abolition what Medicare for All did for socialism, you know. And it's kind of like, it's finally like giving people, like, you know, Medicare for All in and of itself isn't a socialist project, or isn't necessarily socialist in any kind of meaningful way, but it's something that socialists organize around and then connected to the larger, broader ideas of what socialism is, you know, at its core, democratizing the economy, right? Not just government support for things, but democratizing all things that deal with the economy. And so I feel like defund the police is that. And, you know, when it comes to media's understandings of it, you know, that is our job, that's our work, you know, as organizers, as change makers, as, you know, influencers, whatever, however you want to call it, right? As musicians, is to make that clear to people. But I think a part of how we get there is giving people tangible kind of tangible decarceral options of how to get there, right? So I think defund the police is part of it. I know abolitionists, at times we have issues with, like, saying more social workers, more teachers, or whatever, right? But I think it is saying, like, giving people, yeah, maybe socialists and teachers, as long as they're not allowed to call police and they can't function in carceral systems, right? You know, you know, it's more EBT, right? Or food stamps, for people who don't know that, but without all the punitive carceral systems that it takes to get to the EBT part, right? So I think bringing out those things, but also making it clear to folks, even in my previous example, that those are decarceral solutions. Those aren't necessarily abolitionists, but they put us on the road and a path to abolition, because as long as it's decreasing police power and decreasing prison power and decreasing carceral, like, force power that the state has, you know.
I don't know why people still celebrate the Boston Tea Party.
Also, too, just like remember, like all those white people who had guns and they had like all the smoke for like the no mask things, but they just didn't do shit. And it was just like all these people, even these white kids, they be calling social justice warriors, like all this other stuff, like they were actually fighting cops. And like these white people with guns who are just like acting like they're about that life, were just not about that life. I know that's probably totally off topic, Charles. I'm so sorry about this, but it was just like these white people so always pretend they were about that life, and they had their chance. And then Z and millennials, like off of campuses, and we all know who they are. They came with the smoke, like more than them. Anyways, I'm done. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, hella smoke. And yeah, hella smoke. And then to pick you off what Jason said, like, yeah, a lot of history can teach a lot of shit. History can teach a lot of lessons. And it isn't always like the majority that happen to like shift society and the way society is. So I mean, fuck Lloyd Lightfoot. Like, long story short, that's that. He's just scared.
I just want to add one real quick thing, which is, look, I don't know a ton about opinion polls and all those polls that they do where they measure people and their thoughts and, you know, how does that match up with demographics and stuff. But I have been reading and seeing a lot that liberal, rich white folks are the most likely to identify with very radical politics, way far above Black and brown people, though Black and brown people often are the most reliably Democratic voting. And I've been, for the past several years and increasingly now recently, like just having a lot of anxiety over that, because I certainly don't care what white people think, you know, but I really do care that our people are with us as we do this work. And so just been sort of, you know, the other day I got this email from a white law professor at Columbia that said she's going to have a symposium on abolition of the child welfare system. And it was just, I was aghast and I was frightened that perhaps one of the first big sort of public facing events around this area of injustice and abolition is going to be held by a bunch of white liberal law professors. So just personally, you know, I think for the work that we are trying to do, it has just been forced us to really like sort of redouble our commitment to making sure that we're just speaking to our people, you know? Yeah, that's all.
I know we're at time, I'm sorry. I don't want to like push back, but I also want to like challenge that just a little bit also, because I do think that I would agree that white people are talking about this a lot. I feel like they're quick to jump on something, but on a surface level. Like it reminds me of just like Nike coming out and being like, we support Black Lives Matter while they continue to oppress like Black and brown garment workers. So it feels like a lot of like revolution washing is like what I call that, of like they like to hop on like a very surface level. Like, yeah. Or the fact that like they want to have this event at Columbia, but why don't they talk about the legacy of like Columbia, like the fact that it's on stolen land, like the fact that there are like not enough like Black professors, you know, and like all of like the violence institutionally that isn't that sexy work, or brands coming out being like, we want to center Black voices now. Like, what does that even mean? You know, if you're an all white staff, how can you center Black voices with like white leadership? So I think that I do think that white people are talking a lot, but I don't think they need to be doing that. And I don't think that they're like, I think that there's like different intentions underneath a lot of that. Because I think we also should remember that like white people voted for Trump, you know, and that's another thing, you know, like we talk about democracy, but like look who's in charge. And so I think that we also can't even have a conversation about democracy when like all of the institutions that need to be free and like open, like the media or access to polling stations, for example, don't even are like complicating that. So yeah, I just want to challenge that just a little bit.
Be greedy and like squeak in another question, but I need you all's consent because we're at time. So thumbs up if I can, thumbs down if y'all like ready to go. Okay, one more question. and it's two, and you can make it as quick as possible or whatever. But in her op-ed for the New York Times, Mariam Kaba proposed an immediate demand to cut the number of police in half and their budget in half. Is this an actionable and acceptable initial demand to reach abolition? Is it too high, too low? Also, what does and what does the economy look like in an abolitionist world?
These are your short questions?
Yes.
So to Mariam Kaba, yes, 1,000%. You know, in Chicago, we said 75%. Because we just found no path to, I mean, we didn't burn down a police station in Chicago, so we didn't feel like we had the political democratic will to like say disband. If we would have turned up like that, then we would have been like disband, you know. But since that didn't happen, we're like, okay, let's start the negotiations at 75%. And that's just to like keep, you know, especially like more leftist groups, radical groups accountable to that, and then hopefully move along the aldermen and the city council and other like labor groups, you know, like more on the progressive edge of things. So I think that's important. I think that's fundamental. I do not think you can get to, if your vision of liberation deals with decolonization, if your vision of liberation and emancipation deals with socialism, anti-capitalism, if your vision of liberation deals with feminism, right? I don't think you can public policy-wise and law-wise and government-wise get there without shrinking police and prison power. You know, the point of police and prisons is not just to control the working class, right? And not just to marginalize Black folks and folks of color, but it's to control how we politically organize, right? It's to control literally what the First Amendment guarantees us, like our right to assembly and association, and then to do what we want in when we assemble and associate and for collective power. So, and then the second question was how I want the economy to look. I mean, for me, I want, you know, radical democratic socialism. You know, that's decolonial, and that's feminist and centers the lives of queer and trans folks. What that means is, you know, decommodifying all things that we need for, you know, food, clothing, shelter, and just to live a happy life. Decommodifying means not necessarily the absence of money, but money that's publicly controlled, not controlled by private interests like it is today. And that I don't have to work. If I don't want to work in order to like get money, then I don't have to work. So like universal basic income, a guaranteed job for all who want it, you know, Medicare for all. And that's just like, and then cooperatively owned everything. So Amazon would be cooperatively owned. Facebook, who I give so much labor to and give value to, right? Every single day, all of us do, cooperatively owned. Zoom, what we're on right now, right, would be cooperatively owned because we gave value to it, right? So think of all the companies that have started to make billions because of it. That is social media general strike, right? Exactly. So all of those things would be cooperatively owned, and, you know, and ran by us, and we would get value for that. So that's like my vision of it. And I mean, that's not really my vision. That's like W.B. Du Bois, what he meant by abolition democracy and everything like that. So yeah, that's all I got.
I don't got much to add to that.
Closing remarks, anyone? Well, it looks like we're at time, 7:05. Again, thank you all to our guests who joined us for our abolitionist salon. They said what they said, and they mean it. Again, follow Injustice Watch, our Twitter. Go to our website, www.injusticewatch.org. Subscribe to our newsletter, and to keep you updated on the latest criminal justice journalism that we do. Thank you all for joining us for this Salon Talk this evening. Good night.